Today is July 17th, 2023. My name is Ian Kim, and I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. I'll be interviewing Cyrus Bharucha, a member of the Zoroastrian community in Houston. Thank you so much for allowing me to interview you today.
Welcome.
So, to get into your early experiences, can you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in 1941, October the 30th, I believe in the early hours of the morning in Bombay, India, which was at the time under the British Raj and in the middle of the Second World War.
I see. And can you tell me about your experiences growing up during that time in that place?
Well, my parents were, I suppose, what one would today call an upper middle class family. My father's parents were lawyers, and my mother's parents were businessmen and artists. And so I grew up in an environment which was, as I would say, upper middle class. And this was during the war years. So I was put into a boarding school at a very young age of 3. I've never quite understood why, but that's what it was. And I spent my entire life, school life, from going from one boarding school to another. Excuse me. My father was a pilot, and he was the founder of Air India today. He was one of the 3 people that founded Air India. And he was the first paid pilot for Air India. And he was with them for 8 years. And after that, he went to the Maharaja of Jaipur, where he was the pilot for the Maharaja. In those days, Maharajas had airports and planes of their own. Let me just switch this off. They had planes of their own. And so he was in charge of the airport, the aerodrome, and the fleet of planes that the Maharaja of Jaipur had. Then when the war started with Japan in 1942, he was seconded by the Royal Indian Air Force and flew for the Air Force and was decorated with the DFC and AFC for flying with them.
So, how old were you when this all happened?
Well, during the war, I was born 41, so this was all through my early years in the 40s, which would take, I was at school in a place called Khandala, St. Peter's Khandala, when I was 3 years old. It was basically run by nuns mainly. And then I was sent to another boarding school, which was a very exclusive prep school in India called Welham, which is in a place called Dehradun. And I was 6 years old, and I was accompanied by senior boys who were at the senior school there, which is called Doon School. And they were all of 13 and 14 years old. And we used to go on a 2.5-day train ride in those days to Dehradun. And each term was about 5 months long, 4 to 5 months long. And we would stay there and then come back for a 2-month holiday and then go back again and for another 4 months. So that way, 12 months of the year was covered. And I was there from 1947 to 1950. Then I was pulled out, and for reasons best known to my mother, I was brought back to where we have a country estate called Panchgani. And I went to a local school there, but a boarding school again, called St. Peter's. And I was there for 3 years. And my father had died back in 1948. And it was his wish that I should always go to England. So in 1953, when I was 11 years old, I was sent to England to a boarding school there. and to live with my aunt and uncle. My mum's oldest sister, her name was Gould, and my uncle's name was George Blackburn. And I went to England and I lived with them for the next 20 odd years.
Okay, so before we get into the England part, so since you were jumping around between boarding schools for most of or almost the entirety of your early life, um, did you feel a lot of like influence from your parents, or was it just not there? And then did you feel anything towards that, or?
No, it's a good question. No, I had no real influence from my parents. My influence came really from school and from the teachers at school, I suppose. Yeah, I never felt any parenting, and I never felt any real family. That was something I've missed my whole life, and I've sort of talked about it, and we can talk about it later about when I tried to talk to my mother. But no, I missed that sort of family life because all I ever had was going back during the holiday period and then back again to school. And then when I went to England, I didn't see my mum for years.
I see. So did anyone feel like that sort of like a gap in your life, or was it just stayed there for
No, I don't think so. I think my aunt and uncle were kind to me in the sense that they gave me a place to live, but they couldn't take the place of parents. I don't think they, and and then they also had my two other cousins who my mother's brother, Basie, had sent my cousins Zal and Jimmy after me to stay with us. So the three boys kind of grew up together. They were lucky. Their parents saw them regularly. Either they came to England to see them, or the years that they didn't come to England, they would go to Burma. They lived in Burma at the time. So they would go there, but I was always just stuck in England.
So do you feel any jealousy towards them, or sort of
No, never jealousy. No, never ever jealousy. No. It's just what they were. No. That I don't that feeling actually it's interesting. It never came up. No. I just thought that's the way it is. I mean that
then do you feel like a longing for some kind of like family that they had, or?
yes, I did. Oh, absolutely. I definitely felt I wish I could see my mum, my sister, my grandparents, my aunt. I was very fond of my aunt who lived in India. Um, her name was Shireen Virji. She was the first Indian to get into the Royal Academy of Art in the 1930s. Amazingly talented sculpture, but unfortunately she had arthritis and was never able to fulfill her destiny really as a great sculptress. No, I of course definitely missed all that. Yeah.
All right. So going off of that, were there any specific childhood memories that stood out? Because it might have been like very hectic moving from one place to another, going to England all of a sudden as well. So are there any important memories that you had in back in Bombay, India during that time?
Well, I think I had very fond memories of my short times in Jaipur, which is where my father was based. My father uh, had an extraordinary life for 20 years. He became a pilot, he trained in England, and he, as I said, was a founder of an airline and then went on to work for the Maharaj of Jaipur, etc. Now, we lived in Jaipur, so I have very fond memories of that, going hunting with him, for example, going duck hunting and boar hunting with him. I was a little boy and I used to have to sit in the jeep or sit in the back of the group that was duck hunting. And we had a dog who would run after the shot ducks and pick them up and bring them And Dad used to also shoot peahens in the garden, which was illegal in those days. And we would have to bury the feathers and eat the peahen. The kansama, the cook that we had, would cook the peahen, and we would have it for dinner. So those are sort of memories of him that I remember. School, there were. I just was never really very happy at my school in India. Welham I liked a lot. In fact, I visited Welham 2 years ago on my sort of 70th year of leaving it. And I think possibly now that I look back on it as an adult, at school I must have been fairly depressed at times, mainly because, of course, I heard all the other boys meeting their parents and going on holidays with them and things like that, and something I never did. I just went back to my aunt and uncle's place, and I would wind up going to the cinema a lot. I loved movies, and from a very early age, I had made up my mind that that's what I want to do. I want to make films, and of course, as we will come to it eventually, that's what I did.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw what you did later on in your life, so that's very impressive. Um, and sort of going towards that topic a little bit, and sort of deviating from like the childhood memories. Um, well, sort of still staying in that range though. Do you have any Zoroastrian influence in your life during that time? Because it seemed
Absolutely none.
no,
Absolutely none. No.
I see.
We can come to that a little later on of how that happened, but no, absolutely zero. I had had my nojot, which is like a bar mitzvah or a christening, you could call it, when I was 9 years old. And at that time, you had to learn a book of prayers, which is about that thick, and by heart. And you wore a special woolen string that was wound round your waist twice, with a reef knot in the front and a reef knot at the back, and a special vest which was made out of muslin. And you always wore that. In fact, I only stopped wearing it a few years ago, ever since I started wearing more t-shirts than shirts. So, but no, I had absolutely no religious teachings whatsoever.
I see. Then I want to sort of move on to your life in England. So you said you moved to England at like age 11, right? So what are your thoughts and feelings about your time in England? Like transitioning to this new environment, going to this new place, meeting a lot of different new people. What are your thoughts?
My thought, actually, I was excited about going to England. I mean, I didn't realize that by going to England at that time, I would not see my mum for years and years. My feeling was that at least every alternate year, I would come back to India for a long summer holiday, things like that. That never happened. So I was quite excited. I was at a boarding school in India, that's St. Peter's, which I didn't like at all. The food was terrible. My house was all of 200 yards away, and I was still a boarder, which I really resented. Um, and then going to England was an adventure. I mean, I was really looking forward to it. It was built up in a big way for me, that this was a big deal that I should be going to England. And it was. I mean, the cost of my school fees were there, of course, and I was going away 9,000 miles. But it was a shock, not a shock, no. Let me see how I felt. Going to a boarding school was nothing new. Keep in mind, I've been in boarding school since the age of 3, so that wasn't a big thing. I think the culture, the teachings, and how we were taught was very different. You were expected to have a lot more initiative than we were in Indian schools. The teaching method of the masters was very different. You were made to think, even at that early age, much more for yourself. And I wasn't sort of used to all that. I was kind of told, this is what it is, and don't ask questions, and shut up, Bharucha. I just told you this, so that's how it is. Whereas in England, you were asked to question the teacher. And that I found very interesting. So for a while, I didn't do very well at school in my work, because I found kids were doing homework in their spare time and stuff like that. And I wasn't used to doing all that. So that didn't, so as I say, for a while, I didn't do very well. And but what I was good at was things like my general knowledge was very good. And I was very good at organizing things. So one of the first things I did in my early days was organize a form club. A form is a classroom, as a class, like you have standard 1, 2, 3. In England, we have form 2, form 3, form 4, and so forth. So I arranged a club, and that club would take people out to places and things like that. And so I found that I had this so-called talent, if you like, for arranging things. So that kind of made me popular. But as I say, I wasn't very good at a lot of the lessons. I was always very weak at maths and science, but I was good in the arts. The liberal arts were very good. I was good at history, geography, English literature, that sort of thing. Even scripture. Now, that's a funny thing. Ever since I came to England, from the first exam to the very last exam years later, I always came top in scriptures. This is what some people call Bible study here in America. And people thought I cheated. I never cheated. I mean, how could I cheat? It's impossible in a classroom which is wide open and everyone can see what you're doing. So no, it was just that I treated scripture as history, and I was good at history. So I always, for some strange reason, always came top in scripture.
Yeah, I'm also very not very a maths guy, and like more of a history, English literature. So that,
Oh,
yeah. So I kind of want to go back to the part where you said you were like popular. So what was your social life like in this like new environment? Because I imagine like there weren't a lot of Indian people like back then in England, and like seeing someone like come from that place would have been like sort of like an eye opener for some people. I'm guessing. So
very good question, Ian. I never felt as if I was segregated in any way. I believe people used to make fun of me because of the way I spoke, because I spoke with a very Indian accent at that time. And an Indian accent is very close to what the English like to think is a Welsh accent. So I would speak a little bit. You see, I'm coming from Bombay, and I'm coming to England now, and I want to be part of the school over here. So I would be talking like this. So they found that very funny. And they would call me the English. Actually, one of the teachers nicknamed me the Indian Welshman. And I guess over the years, I suppose, I lost it. But that was the sort of one bit of teasing that I had, but it was never racist, or at least I never thought it was. Today, I suppose, under the present circumstance, people would call it racist and this and that. But I never thought. I just went along with it. I didn't think they were any better than me. In fact, some people might think that I was a little superior compared to them. No, but socially got on pretty well. And we had an African the only African in the school at the time, Aki, who went on to become a surgeon. Then we had a boy from Ceylon, Fonseca, who I became very friendly with. And my other very close friend was an Egyptian boy. His father was an ambassador in London, Egyptian ambassador. And Kamal Wasif and I became very close friends. So just because we were foreigners, we were friends. But at the same time, it wasn't like we were a clique. We also stayed friends. We were friends with everyone. We were pretty good, actually. The only time ever anything about India came up was about when we were in sport and playing cricket, something like that. But otherwise, no, there wasn't any racism.
And you also mentioned that you had a club that you created, or like, do you have any memories of that, or was that just
Yes,
something?
yeah. Well, I was a so-called entrepreneur, I suppose you could say. The first club I started was a comics club. In those, we used to get sheets of paper which had comics, or what would you call them? Funnies, I suppose they call them in America. And they were also, and they would cost tuppence and threepence at that time. So I would buy them with my pocket money, and I got myself a desk at the corner of the classroom, and I created a comic library, and everyone could borrow it from me for a penny. So at the end of the week, I actually made a profit. And then I would go out and buy more comics. So it became a kind of a bit of a joke, really, of Cyrus and his comic library. So that's how. And then I decided the following year, when we were 1 year older, of starting a club where we would. And I got one of the masters, our form master, Mr. Charlesworth, to become the so-called president of the club, and I was the secretary. And I said, so why can't we go out and visit places, like the railway works. There was where we were in Canterbury. There's a famous railway works in Faversham, or Ashford, actually. And so we went to where they built trains, literally built trains, carriages. So we went there. That's what one of them thing. Then we had a tour of Canterbury Cathedral because we were studying history at the time. So, and it was our local cathedral. So we had a special tour of that. And then we used to have Christmas parties. So I used to arrange the Christmas parties. And those were very popular with the boys. I mean, anything to do with food and boarding schools, very popular. So, yeah, I suppose there was a sort of a leadership thing that came out of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about that, but just for time's sake, I want to move on to your college life. Since you said you completed a Bachelor of Science in Photography, so can you tell me a little bit more about that, like just how your college life was like going into that major and just the experiences that you
Right.
had?
Well, college life, as you call it, wasn't really a college life as you know it, being at Rice. I was, I wanted to get into the film industry. And I looked around, and people said, the BBC has a film department. So I went and met someone at the BBC department, a man called Reno Whiteson, and he became a kind of mentor for me. He said, "Look, why you're too young? You're 18 years old. It's too young to take you on, but we can take you on when go and study photography." He himself was a very keen amateur photographer. So I went there to what was then called the Polytechnic, Regent Street Polytechnic, which is today called the University of Westminster. And they had what was then the best photography school in the world by far. And I enlisted for evening classes. And I got myself a job as an assistant to a famous food photographer called Roy Rich. and I worked for him and the company that was there at the time. And then I don't know why, but I got fired from there by the owner of the company, who was an American and called Bob Carrier. Now, he became a very famous gourmet chef and wrote a lot of books, and actually for a while became extremely famous. And I don't know why, to this day, why I was fired. I was just told not to come back on Monday. Now, whether they got someone else or a friend in or something, I have no idea. So I went and worked for a while at a ticket agency. And that was great because I got to see all the shows in town. It was wonderful because we got free tickets to show all the shows in town. So we used to go every week, we went to at least 2 shows. And then I was still going in the evening for these evening classes. Then I got an opportunity to work at the Science Museum as a photographer. And that was fantastic because the science museums, all the museums in England are run by the civil service. So I went and worked at the Science Museum as an assistant photographer to begin with. And they sent me to the same school, but in a different way. Every Tuesday, I went for the full day. And then Wednesday, Thursdays, and Fridays, I went to evening classes. And I took a proper course, which is the IBM course, which is the Institute of British Photographers course. And that was great. They paid for me. They paid me to go to the class. They paid my school fees. I mean, it was superb. And unfortunately, the first 2 exams I failed, because one thing that I didn't realize going to photography was that it consisted of maths, physics, and chemistry, 3 of my absolute worst subjects. So the first 2 exams I failed. And I passed the practical. The practicals were very good for me, and I did very well, but you had to pass everything. And so I was sort of read the riot act by my boss by saying, if you don't pass the 3rd time, it's bye-bye time. And God, did I study. And what it did teach me in my life is that if you really put your mind to something which you think you're weak at or you're not very good at, you can still do it. And I did. And then when I passed that exam, and then we came to the next big exam 3 years later, and I eventually came 4th in the whole country. So that was, but in terms of my college days, there were not a great deal of socializing in college because, see, we came there on a Tuesday. There were about 10 of us. We just met on that Tuesday. I remember towards the end, we would go out to a movie together or something like that. But we all came from very different parts of London. So we never got together as such. And we would meet for lunch and for tea, coffee and things like that. But that was about it. We never met beyond that. So I never really had a big social life. And my friends were really outside my work and my college. Unlike, being in college full time, like possibly you are and other people, you all have a real sort of college life. I didn't. I never had that. And I guess on the whole, I was sort of quite lonely. I had 1 or 2 good friends who I would go out with, and that was about it. Didn't have many girlfriends at the time. First of all, couldn't afford them, to be honest. And I was always of that school that felt you have to pay for your girlfriends and your dates. I wasn't how today people go Dutch and all that sort of thing. I was always told, no, when you go out with a young lady, you must pay for it. So the few times I went out, I would literally save up for weeks, And I always liked going to nice places. It was never a case of just, oh, shall we go to the movie and get an ice cream afterwards? It was never that. I was always of that mindset of taking someone out to a good dinner and all that.
Were there any relationships that like lasted long, or was it just like all one-time things? Or
No, well, that brings me, I suppose, to the obvious question: what was your first love? And she was someone who I had a crush on when I was 10 years old. And I met her again when I was 15, and I'd gone back to India to visit my mum after 3.5 years at school. And we kept in touch. And she, then when I went back in 1959, when I finished school, I went back for 6 weeks to India, and I met her again. And after that, she sort of broke up with me, and I was very, very sad about that, and that affected me. I felt very rejected. And I suppose when I think back on it, I felt a lot of rejection in my life, having been sent back to England, my mum not being there, my father, as I said, had passed away, and so that was very hard. So I didn't go out with any girls for quite a long time, and as I say, it's once or twice I went out, but it wasn't anything serious. It was a date for dinner or something like that, and that all changed at a later stage, which we'll get into.
So I also want to ask, do you like keep in touch with like some of your friends from boarding school, or was it like, do you like meet new friends outside and just lose all
I
contact?
have one, yes, from my boarding school in India, Panchgani. I had a friend who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. We were very close friends, and we stayed friends. In fact, we produced a film together, which we'll talk about at some time. And I'm very friendly with his brother, who was 2 years younger than me. And to this day, we talked only 2 days ago. So, yeah. And then I have my friend from England, Kevin, who sadly is physically in a very bad state, but I'm very much in touch with him and his family. Yeah.
All right, so now I want to kind of move on to the part of your life, which is like your career as well. So you said you like had like a lot of jobs in photography like during your college life. And was there a single one that like kind of like really hit like sort of like made like a significant difference, or was like like stood out a lot?
No, in photography, I worked for before the job, actually before my job at the Science Museum. I'd also worked with a man called John French. Now, John French was a very famous photographer at the time, a fashion photographer, but unfortunately, he wasn't very well. And after a few weeks, he was diagnosed with cancer. And unfortunately, I had to leave him. That was a big thing. The other part that we haven't really gone into is while I was at the Science Museum, I had always wanted to come and live in America. I'd love films, and I wanted to get into the film business. But I thought, if it's going to be difficult, I'd like to become a photographer in America. And I had a great passion for great American photographers. And I wrote to, of all places, Playboy, which I was a great admirer of. I mean, for the obvious reasons of all the girly pictures and all that. But Playboy used to have a very superb range of photography in food, fashion, all sorts of things besides their girly pictures. And I wrote, and a photographer there that I admired a great deal called Mario Caselli. And so I wrote to him in Chicago. They were based in Chicago. And to my surprise, I got a letter back from Mario Caselli offering me the job, but I had to make my own way to Chicago and I would be his assistant. And sent him a portfolio of my work. And because at the Science Museum, one of the things besides doing all the objects at the Science Museum, we had a lot of spare time during lunch hours and things where we could use the studio to do our own photography. So I'd bring girlfriends who were models and things like that in and take pictures of them. Or friends would come in and I would do portraits of them, stuff like that. So I had built up a pretty impressive portfolio at that time. So, and then I wrote to several American photographers, Richard Avedon, Art Kane, several others, Irving Penn. And again, I got a reply from Art Kane in New York offering me a job. Now, in those days, to immigrate to America, you had to have a number. And I think it's still the same. And when your number came up, you were given 6 months to make the move. And if you didn't, your number went away and you probably start all over again. So my number came up when I turned 22, just before I turned 22, in 1963. And I applied, mentioned to Mario Caselli at Playboy that I would come and work for him. And he offered me at that time, I think it was $90 a week. But I didn't have the money. And I was going to have to try and persuade my mum, who wasn't very keen, A, that I should be going to Playboy, and B, that I should be a photographer. I mean, those weren't serious careers. She didn't realize what a big magazine Playboy was, and etc. Anyway, what happened suddenly is that I get a letter from the BBC in November of 63, telling me to come for a board interview for a trainee cameraman, film cameraman's job. So I went, I took my portfolio there, and I met Reno Whiteson, who was on the board, who was the man who first advised me to take up photography. And I just knew the minute I walked in, I've got this job. And I did. I got the job, and I had to write back to Playboy and everyone else to say that, thank you, but no thank you, I've got this job at the BBC. And that was a huge turning point in my life.
Yeah, I definitely think just getting a letter from BBC out of the news would have been pretty shocking.
Yeah.
So I saw that you worked at BBC for 11 years, right? Was it 12? Yeah. So during that long period of time, what was like some of the most standout moments in that time? Like not just like filming, shooting movie videos or anything like that, or taking pictures, like just inside the industry as well. You can also include like things involving working on like on the shoots and everything, but I also want to sort of see how the industry worked as well, and like in behind the scenes, I see. Yeah.
Okay. All right. The BBC gave me possibly the greatest training ground I've ever had. For a start, you spent 3 months in the classroom alone, just basically learning the theories and the way the BBC works. And this was not video, by the way. This was pure film. This was the largest film studio in the world, and it was based at a place called Ealing. And you're too young to remember, but Ealing was a very big film studio in the heydays of British filmmaking. And they were particularly famous for what were called Ealing comedies. And a lot of very famous British films of the 40s and 50s came out of Ealing Studios. And the BBC bought Ealing over in 56, I think, 57, and turned it into a television film studio. So what we did was we didn't do anything to do with video. We just pure film. And it was a special culture there. I mean, there's no question about that. It was a culture of a kind of hierarchy culture where the cameraman was at the top, and then you had the assistant, then you had sound recorders and assistant sound recorders and electricians and gaffers and grips and so forth. There was an absolute hierarchy. And it was very precise how the work that you did. I mean, you had to work in a certain system, which is a little complicated to explain to a layperson, but there was definitely a culture at the BBC, and on the whole, a good one. But there was also that old, slightly upper class, lower class kind of culture where we were actually told, oh, by the way, you must always carry a matchbox with you or a lighter, because your cameraman, because as an assistant, your cameraman might want to light his cigarette, so you should light a cigarette. I couldn't do it. I just could not do it. First of all, I hated smoking. And secondly, it just wasn't me to start lighting up my cameraman's cigarettes for him. But that was the kind of thing, you should always be there if he's carrying his bag, offer to carry his bag for him, and I wasn't going to be his servant. I remember I came from India where we had servants and so forth. So I certainly wasn't going to do that. But that changed, that I must say, over the next several years, that all that changed. A lot people of my generation weren't willing to do all that nonsense, in terms of the work, there's a lot of camaraderie, a lot of good camaraderie. I mean, there's rivalry there as well and all that, but made some very good friends there, I have to say. And because we all had something in common. And the other thing was we traveled a lot. I mean, we traveled the length and breadth of England, United Kingdom, not just England, from Scotland from John O'Groats to Land's End, from Wales to Anglesey, to Anglia. So we traveled a lot in England. And then we traveled a lot all over the world. I mean, I literally went around the world with the BBC. From Japan, spent months in Japan. I spent many, many months in America at the time. That just fell in love with America. All over the continent, India, North Africa, West Africa, all over the world. I mean, that was, and then on top of that, of course, you worked with so many interesting people besides actors, because the film department covered every aspect of the BBC's work, from drama to documentaries, to current affairs, to education, to sports. I mean, you think of every program the BBC does, we covered it in some form or another. So, so I got to know, not just got to know, but got to know politicians. One of my fun stories is meeting the Queen. We were in 1965. The Queen was going to do her first color broadcast of the Christmas speech. Before that, it had always been done in black and white. And Tony Amy, who was the cameraman I was working with, myself, and a couple of electricians were sent to Buckingham Palace to set up the lighting for what would be required for the speech. And we were there with a man called Anthony Craxton, and who had done the Queen's coronation some 12 years earlier in 1953. And so we were working in this room, and a little lady walked into the room, and we just continued working. And then suddenly Tony said, gentlemen, just come line up. And we did. And to my surprise, it was the Queen. And what shocked me was how small she was. She's really a tiny lady. And so we all lined up, and I was at the end of the queue, and she went down the line saying, hello, 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 and saying a few nice words to people. She came to me and she said, and where are you from? And I said, Croydon. And she sort of smiled, and she said, no, but is that where you were born? Where were you born? So I said, oh, India. She said, oh, so you're part of our Commonwealth. So I said, yes, I am. She said, oh, well, we're very proud of India. And, so I have something that's very special. And I said, oh. And she said, yes, it's a shawl that was woven for me and by Mahatma Gandhi. And he presented it to me and the Duke of Edinburgh on our wedding in 1947. And I said, oh, I knew Mr. Gandhi. And she said, no, you're much too young. And I said, no, I was, he used to come to our house and then I sort of tell the story of how he used to recuperate from his fasting and come and recuperate in Panchgani, which was far away from the madding crowd and so forth. So now we're having this chat, and everyone's looking at me thinking, what the hell bloody Cyrus going on about? And finally, she left, and we carried on with our work. And this lady walks in, and she said, who's Cyrus? And she's carrying a box. And I said, I am. And she said, oh, Her Majesty wants you to see this. And she opened the box, and there was the shawl that Mr. Gandhiji had made for her. And I have to just tell my sister I'll call her back. So she gave me I saw the box, and I said, can I touch it? And she said, yes, of course you can. And she said, Her Majesty wanted you to see this shawl. I thought that's such a wonderful gesture. I mean, who was I? And the fact that she took the trouble to send someone down so that I could actually see the shawl. So that was wonderful. And so that, I mean, one of my great thrills was meeting I'm very fond of opera and classical music, and spent 4 days with Maria Callas, and whose photograph is actually right behind me over there. And then the big thrill of my life was meeting my hero, Muhammad Ali. I spent 4 days with him. And that brings me back to your early question on Zoroastrianism, because I was mad keen to talk to him about his boxing days. I was a great boxing fan in those days. And he had no interest in talking to me about boxing. He wanted to know about, well, first he asked me, he said, are you Muslim? So I said, no, I'm not Muslim. And I'm Zoroastrian. And he went, what? And at those days, I knew very little about our religion, very little. So he took me for a walk. He said, do you want to go for a walk with me? I said, yeah, sure. So we go for a walk, and he's asking me all about my religion. And I know little to nothing, and I'm literally making up stuff as we go along. I mean, things that sounded credible, and I knew a little bit, so I was talking to him about. But that told me that one day I should make a film about my religion, because like me, there's so many Parsis who are completely ignorant of our religion. We know our prayers, but we know little to nothing about it. So many years later, I went on to make a film, which we'll talk about later. But that's how it started.
That sounds very
Yeah.
interesting. I'm actually really fond of Zoroastrianism myself, so I tried reading
Oh,
the first, so yeah. Um, so I would really love to talk more about your time in BBC, but I kind of want to move on to other stuff in our time constraint. So can you tell me about like how that 12 how those 12 years of working at the BBC kind of ended? I kind of wanted to know about that.
yeah. That was an unfortunate ending. I became a producer at the BBC. I was given what they call an acting position as a producer. And without sounding absurdly arrogant, I had I realized that that's what I was meant for, much more than a cameraman. And I had a very successful, uh, almost 18 months as a producer. And the time came when they would have to make me up as a permanent producer. And they have what they call boards, where you go in front of a board and they pick you and I was told by everyone that I would never see the gates of Ealing again. Literally, those were the words used, Ealing being the film studio, that I'd had an extremely successful period as a producer. I'd covered the floods in Pakistan, I'd covered the famine in West Africa, I'd gone to the Yom Kippur War, I'd gone to Kuwait, and my big scoop was that I brought over Albert Speer, who was Hitler's munitions minister and architect. And it was a big story. It may not mean a lot to people today, but that was a huge story then. And it made the front page of newspapers and everything else. And I don't know if we've got the time to go into that, but how I brought him over. So everyone said, you're a shoo-in, you're going to get this. And the shock was I didn't get it. And I was then told that maybe on the next round I would get it. And this was very disappointing to me. And so I went back to Ealing as a cameraman, and I wasn't being treated very well because by that time they realized that I had no sort of future there. And an incident happened where, while I was working in America as a camera, they posted me to America, and I was covering Watergate at the time. And so, as I'd been a producer, they thought I would be able to do this quite well. And I'd covered Watergate as well as a producer. And someone helped me, and instead of getting paid, he said, "Can I have 2 rolls of film?" I didn't think twice about it and gave him 2 rolls of film. Over a year goes by now, and I get a phone call from a friend and colleague, actually, at the BBC, saying, "By the way, did you ever give 2 rolls of film to someone?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I did. This person, they helped us out, and he didn't want to get paid in cash, so he asked me for 2 rolls of film." To my surprise, this man goes and reports me to the management. And the management made a big deal out of it. This one person, I should say, the head of the management, made a big deal out of it, and told me that he's going to make sure that I never become a producer. And that kind of shocked me.
Did you know why they said that, or it's just like,
Yeah, he said because of giving the 2 rolls of film. I said, I thought, do you know what goes on in this place? I wanted to tell him, that, people are fiddling all kinds of things, stealing stuff, this, that, the other, all kinds of stuff goes on with expenses and so forth. I mean, and I'm talking about, I even offered to pay for the 2 rolls of film. And anyway, I think he just didn't like me or whatever it was, because I later heard that if it had been, and also one of the reasons that I didn't get the job the first time round as a producer was I was told point blank, "You're not English, Cyrus." And that was the other big surprise to me. After all, I'd been living in England for over 20 years, grew up in England. My uncle was English. English. I grew up in a very kind of traditional English family. It wasn't a sort of curry and rice kind of Indian family, you know. So that was a huge surprise and a shock. And I realized that if that's the case, it's time to go. And the people I'd met in America said to me, "Why don't you come here and work for us?" So that's how I left the BBC. Not
So
a very happy way.
that must have been very disappointing and sort of like
Well,
shocking as well at the same time. I would love to talk about this more, but can we also move on to like the film that you made? Like how like you sort of adjusted this was after BBC, right?
I came to America and I worked for PBS in America. I was immediately made within a year. I was made executive producer for the PBS, and with my experience, and I was placed in Minneapolis. I first worked in Washington for WETA. I produced a couple of programs for them, and then I did a lot of advertising work. The company that I joined in America was Cinemaster Studios, small company, and but we did a lot of commercials. We used to do car commercials every week for local car dealers. So that was it was a small income that we used to get. And then we had a terrible winter that year of 76, 77, and didn't work at all. In fact, I slipped and I lost the use of my shoulder here. I fell and came right up. And so I was in a sling for quite a while. So I didn't work for many months. It was a very difficult period. But my green card came through at the beginning of early part of 77. And suddenly the doors opened up and I got offers in Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, so forth. And I took the job in Minneapolis as an executive producer for cultural programming. And that was a great time,
And then how did you sort of like get into starting to film the movie On Wings of Fire, was it?
Well, that was much, much later.
Oh, that
You
was
see,
much.
I worked uh, for PBS for 3 years in Minneapolis, and I produced all kinds of programs, including 2 Emmy-nominated programs. Um, and then I got a job offer at CNN when it first started. My assistant sent in my application to CNN. I didn't even know CNN or anything else, but we'd heard about it because we were working on a job one day, and someone said, "Oh, do you know there's a cable network," which I knew little about, starting up in Atlanta called Cable News Network, CNN. Why don't you apply there? They're looking for people. And I said, "Really? I'm not really interested." And Marianne sent in my application, and I got a phone call one morning and said, "We would love to meet you." So they flew me down there. And the next thing I know is they offered me a job. So I went down there, and job they offered me wasn't what they offered. Well, it wasn't what we talked about originally, because I said to them, the one thing I won't do is a talk show. And what do they offer me? A talk show. They may to work with a really dumb um, host called Sandy Freeman. She came from AM America, Chicago, and she was a disaster. And so rather stupidly, I resigned from there. And then they did, in all fairness to them, although I sort of asked them that they needed to compensate me, um, they offered me another job. Yeah, and in all fairness to them, they offered me either a news anchor's job, or I could have the whole weekend and become executive producer for the weekend, the entire weekend, Saturday, Sunday programming. And I don't know why now. Probably because one was depressed. I have no idea. I didn't take the job. And I've always regretted that later on. And then I went to work for a short time for Francis Coppola, who directed The Godfather. And there was a film that I did when I was at PBS called Napoleon, with a man called, with its original director, Abel Gance, who was 93 years old. And I did a program with him. And Abel came to Minneapolis, and I did a film for PBS on that. And because I was involved with that, when Francis took over Napoleon and started to tour the country with it, I became one of the producers that took it around the country. So I made some money that way. And that was a great experience. It was something very different. It was being a promotional producer, very different work. And so I did that. And then I got a job with the Children's Television Workshop called 321 Contact. It was a science program for kids. So I produced that. And I could have stayed on there for years. But I'd already put into motion this film that I wanted to make, On Wings of Fire, which is on my community. So I said to the executive producer of Wings of Fire and of 321 Contact, give me 18 months to go away and I'll come back. And he said, lovely, come back whenever you like. So thinking that, 18 months, I'll finish the film and I'll be back in New York and I've got a job waiting for me. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, because what I thought was 18 months eventually became a very tiresome, almost, 82, 83, 4, 5, 6, almost over 4 years. Very, very tough 4 years. But I did make the film. I got the money. I'd never made much money out of it, but the film did get made.
So can you also talk about sort of like the process of making the film? You said it went on for like way longer than you expected it to, like sort of delve into that.
Sure. As a matter of fact, I'm giving a talk next month on what it is to be a producer. Well, yes. As I told you, I knew very little about about the religion. So I started to research it. And I went literally around the world on my own money, from Hong Kong to Canada, to Germany, England, and parts of America, talking to scholars about our religion. And I needed to get some money, and I went to India, and I spoke to the Tata company. Tatas were the people. Mr. J.R.D. Tata was the original founder of Air India, and it's India's largest company. It's conglomerate, and it has, I think, 27 companies or something like that. So I went to him, and he put me in touch with his right-hand person, a man called Nani Palkiwala, who was the greatest legal mind in India, one of the great lawyers of India. In fact, my last film that I made was on him. Anyway, so then I first went to Zubin Mehta, the conductor, because he is one of us. And I said to him, would you be in this film? And he said, yeah, I'd love to do it. So having got him, I went to the Tatars. They said they would be interested, but they weren't committing to any money. My mum then told me, why don't you go to Hong Kong and Singapore? There are a couple of very rich Parsis there, and they may help you. So on my own, I managed to get a friend who was a travel agent to donate me a ticket. And I went to Singapore, and I met a man called Dadi Balsara, who came into the picture later, and Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, I met this group of Parsis who have what's called the Zoroastrian Association of Hong Kong. And they had a little meeting, and managed to pull together $14,000 for me and literally gave me that in cash. And that helped me eventually get a writer and with some of my expenses. And that got me going. And eventually, because Zubin had committed to being in the film, the people in India started to help me with it. And it's a very long story, actually. And I'm trying to keep it short because there were all sorts of problems with casting and so forth. But eventually the shooting started literally 40 years ago this year in 83. And so that lasted for 6 months. And after that, I didn't have the money to do the post-production. So I managed to get some money to do a rough cut on the post-production. And then we had another hard time getting money in America to do the final post-production. And that went all the way on to 1985. And the person I had met in Singapore all those years earlier finally came through on the condition that I put him in the film. So that was a headache. I mean, where do you sort of put this guy in the film? But $60,000 is $60,000. So I did put him in the film, which didn't help the film at all. And eventually we just cut him out. But the angel of this whole event came when a friend of mine called me up and said, look, I've got someone who wants to make a film in India. And could you meet him and tell him what the do's and don'ts are and how difficult it is to make films there, and what are the advantages? So I met this man called Leonard Garner, and he met him in the Hilton Bar, and we chatted for about an hour and a half. And that was very pleasant, and that was the end of that. But a week later, I get a phone call from him saying, by the way, you haven't sent me a bill. And I said, for what? And he said, for your consultation. I said, no. I said, I enjoyed meeting you. It's very nice. Thank you. He said, no. I believe you need some money for your film. I said, yes. He said, well, bill me $300 an hour. Send me a bill for $600. I said, no, I couldn't do that. And I said, anyway, I don't think $600 is going to make any difference. We're looking for close to $250,000. So there was a pause, and then he said, all right, when you have $150,000, call me and I'll give you the 100,000 for your $250,000. I said, really? I said, yes. And that's exactly what happened. When we had $150,000, I called him up, and sure enough, he invited me to lunch and gave me not only 100,000, but 110,000, and became a friend ever since. So these strange things happen in life, Yeah.
It must have been like a really happy surprise after like all that.
Well, it really was. I mean, it was very stressful. I mean, I used to literally go and say my prayers and all that sort of thing, hoping that this would get made. And it did eventually, as I said, it did get made, but it wasn't the film I wanted, to be honest with you. There were too many compromises and things like that. Today we've redone the show. In fact, 2 years ago, I got some money again from the Tatars, and we reshuffled the film and what do you call it? Restored it, I should say, and cut it down. And it flows fairly well now. It's quite a good film now. It flows fairly well.
You also said that you met like a lot of Zoroastrian scholars and like did like a lot of research yourself. Did that like sort of affect your like sort of practices on the religion or like sort of like your daily lifestyle or anything?
No, I honestly didn't think it did. But what it did do was Zoroastrianism, like so many other religions, has a lot of different points of view. So we had this board of scholars that we invited to Washington to talk to us, and they were all from Iran. And interestingly enough, they have a very Iranian Muslim attitude towards very highly conservative view of what Zoroastrianism should be. And in fact, so much so that when we showed them certain books and things, they actually used the term, oh, we should burn these books. I mean, and I was furious when he said that. I mean, I said, what do you mean? It's not Nazi Germany, burn books, but they came from that kind of culture of Iran. And but then when I spoke to the Mary Boyce in England and the person in Canada, I've forgotten his name now, and so forth, they were much more liberal and much more open-minded about the religion. And that was interesting. I mean, but no, I can't say that I gained knowledge about the religion, but I don't think the basic thoughts and concerns of the religion, which are good thoughts, good words, good deeds, so forth and so on, that was always there. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm practicing them that well, but I try. One tries.
Since we're a little bit low on time, I kind of want to move away from like your career and like the industry and all that, and sort of talk about what we kind of mentioned earlier. Like you said, we're able to like, you mentioned that you had like a wife at a time. Can you?
I got married at a very late age. I was 49 when I got married, and this was to someone that I had had a crush on when I first met her years earlier. I first met her in 1969 when I was in India making a film on Gandhi. And she she was an exceptionally attractive woman and a great personality. And then I didn't see her again for years. In fact, once she reminded me that I'd taken her out on a date in London, and I'd taken her to the Playboy Club of all places. And she said, "And you didn't do anything. You just saw me back at the hotel, kissed me on the cheek, and said good night." She said, "And I was hoping for something more to happen that night." I said, "But you told me you were engaged. So I was just being very honorable." She said, "Well, you didn't have to be that honorable." Anyway, so I meet her in 1984 now. I've come back. I've been making the film in India, and I came back and I bumped into her. And we started, and she'd moved to New York with her family, and she was married at that time. And frankly, an affair started, and that became quite strong. And eventually, and she came to live with me. She divorced her husband. She came to live with me in 1991. We got married, and we stayed married just for a few years till 96, 97. And the problem, very frankly, was over money. She just loved spending money and getting into debt. She and her husband were in debt a great deal, although they had a very rich sister who is married to one of India's billionaires. But the sister wasn't that helpful. So, but they would keep getting into debt, and I refused to live in debt. And unfortunately, we lived in a very nice apartment in New York, what's called a so-called doorman luxury apartment, had a pool and all that sort of stuff. And she wanted a house, and I said no. It wasn't the right time to buy a house, and she got upset about that. And I believe she went back to her ex-husband and made a deal with him and told me that she was divorcing me. And she left. And that was that. That's really the truth and the simple story. And then I believe she got into even more debt later on, but her rich sister bailed them out.
That must have been like very hard for like,
Very
I'm
hard.
not even sure if hard describes that, but did you ever
Yeah.
like recover from that or?
I think so, yes. Ian, it takes time. It took a long time. I have to be honest. It took me 2 years, I think, to get over that. Yeah. You see, previously I'd been a bachelor and I'd had a lot of girlfriends, to be very frank with you. And so getting married, I enjoyed it actually, to begin with. I enjoyed having someone in the house permanently, and I loved her kids. I absolutely adored her kids. And they said to me, you're more our dad than our dad is, and we have much more fun with you and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it was tough for 2 years. Then I got over it, and I'm over it now.
So we're kind of short on time, so I kind of want to talk about your move to the USA. So you mentioned that you moved to Washington in 1976, and this was to like start working for CNN and everything.
No, this was to start with. CNN didn't even exist.
Ah,
This was to start working for a company called Cinemaster Studios, a small Washington, D.C. film company, which had a small studio, which was rented out. And as I said, we would do jobs that we did with little weekly commercials with car dealerships and people like that. And in the meantime, I was given by some good friends at the BBC some excellent contacts with PBS, WETA in Washington. So I went to see them, and they gave me my first sort of couple of big producing jobs, which I produced at Wolf Trap, which is the big venue in Virginia, with the Isaac Esterman, Stern, and Rose trio, which was arguably the greatest classical trio in the world. So I worked with them. And then I was actually offered a job to do the bicentennial film. But the bicentennial film was a co-production with the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian had their person who they'd chosen to make the film. And WETA, who had the controlling interest, had me. And there was a big dispute over that. And the whole thing was scratched. And the funny thing was that I was the front page of the Washington Times made the story. And the person who wrote the story wrote me up as the person for an Indian of Indian derivatives. I think he used the word, I'm of Indian derivative or some term like that. Former BBC producer of Indian derivative. The next thing you know is the Office of Indian Bureau in America calls up Alvin Goldstein, who was then the executive producer, and says, "Oh, we're really concerned that here was an Indian and he was going to be making a film about the America, and they've canceled a film on him. So what tribe does he belong to?" So Alvin, knowing exactly where this was going, said, "Oh, he belongs to the Parsi tribe." So they went, "Whoa, yeah, that's right, the Parsi tribe. Okay, well, we're going to take this to the Senate." So the next thing I know is I'm ordered to go to the Senate to meet Senator, God, I can't remember his name, who was in charge of Indian affairs. And so we go in there, these two from the tribal people and myself, and we're sitting there and chatting away. And he says, "And yeah, I understand you belong to the Parsi tribe. Now, where exactly do they come from?" which part of the country? I said, well, they originally started in Persia, and then they came over to India. And these guys' faces, what? I said, yeah. I said, that's where the Parsis come from. You mean you're not like Native American? I said, no, never said I was. But you're Indian. I said, yes, I am. I'm true India from India. And there was this huge silence in the room. And then the senator started laughing, and I started laughing. He said, you knew what was going to happen, didn't you, Cyrus? I said, absolutely, Senator. But I said, I couldn't resist it. I said, I said, it was a pleasure to meet you all, but I had to resist it. I couldn't resist this. So he said, oh, God. He said, anyway, let's have some tea. And the two Indians were pissed off. I mean, they really looked silly. I said, look, gentlemen, I didn't mean to make up, but I said I couldn't resist it. I said, Alvin also, I said, when you called Alvin up, he told you I was Parsi, and you went, oh, yeah, we know that. You said you knew the Parsi tribe. He said, well, we had to say something. We'd actually never heard of the Parsi tribe. So we had to. Anyway, there we are. That's America for you.
Yeah, that's pretty hilarious. Thinking on it. And you also said that you moved to Houston really recently, like in 2018.
Yeah.
Can you tell me like your decision, like the reason behind your decision?
Oh, well, that was very easy. I'd been in India because I had to go back to sell our country estate, our family estate. And I was the only one who finally did it. Anyway, when I came, I used to live in San Diego before that. And so I came back to San Diego. And I found that, the cost of living was incredibly high. So I came down to visit my cousin, who literally lives down the road, 3 minutes walk from me right here. And I suddenly saw, wow, this is a lovely community. Got a clubhouse, 2 swimming pools, tennis courts, this, that, the other. This would be great. And the cost of housing was ridiculous. It was 1/3 of what it was in San Diego. So I looked around, and so I said, I wonder if there are houses. So he said, yes. We've got a friend who's a real estate agent. So she took me around. And then I came back again a second time. And this time I just bought the house. I saw this house where I'm sitting right now. And I offered them cash for it. And they lowered the price, and I bought it. And that was it. Because the cost of living in Houston is so much lower than San Diego. Although I love California. I mean, if I could afford it, I would go back and live there.
Yeah, I actually came from California, so
Oh,
yeah, the housing prices are really, really high though. So
yeah.
how does Houston compare to like all the other places you've been to? Like because you've been in like so many places, not just as like a photographer, but like
No, living, absolutely, yeah. No, Houston is, I mean, the community, I don't like Texas as politically. I mean, with the conservatives here and the Republicans here, I don't like it at all. But I think as the community that I live in is really nice. It's called Del Webb, and it's 1,300 homes here. It's a very big community, and it's beautifully laid out with a lake and everything else. And we have what they call a clubhouse, and I run a club here. I think we've talked about this before, called That's Entertainment. In fact, tonight we've got about 50 people going to a show with Bobby Darin. It's a tribute to the old great swing singer Bobby Darin. And then on Sunday we're going to a play. So we do a lot of outings, and people are very friendly, I must say. So it's I like. But if I had a choice, I'd live in in San Diego. I love San Diego. And I like the people there, and they're much more liberal and so forth and so on.
Yeah, San Diego is a beautiful place.
Really.
So we almost have to like close the interview out. So like since this is reaching the 1 hour and 30-minute mark, so I just want to ask what are your most proudest moments and achievements in your life? And are there like regrets or things that you wish went differently? Or
Oh, regrets, there are many. Yeah. Achievements. Well, I think if I look at my life as a whole, to be honest, I've done almost everything that I wanted to do, not necessarily most successfully or making a lot of money, which I haven't had a chance to do. But if you look at the range of stuff I've done, I've been a film cameraman, I've been a photographer, I've been a producer for the BBC and CNN and PBS, so big companies. I've run a radio station and I've done broadcasting. I've written 2 books and had them both published, and they're sitting here in my case here. I paint as a hobby. I don't consider myself some great artist, but I paint. I've had a pretty wild social life, I have to say. As a bachelor, I've had a lot of girlfriends, lady friends, and so forth. So I wish I'd had a better marriage. It is one of my regrets. I wish this incident at the BBC hadn't happened, but then when I look back on it, if I hadn't left the BBC, maybe I wouldn't have achieved a lot of the other things that I've done in life. So sometimes it may have been a blessing in disguise. Who knows? But I would have liked to have had a better marriage. That's a big regret in my life. And it would have been nice to have had a full-time partner.
yes. Yeah. I feel like you've went through like a lot of difficult times while achieving almost just as much as well. Honestly, I feel like your life is an inspiration. Like hearing your story, like the way you persevered through everything. And like just thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your story with us. And yeah, just taking the time to talk with me as well.
My pleasure, Ian.
Is there anything else you want to share, or do you think?
I think, yeah, you can go on and on, but I think if you think of anything else and you want to, I'm open to it.
Yeah.
Now at least we know how Zoom works. So that's something.
That's true. Yeah.